Hello, welcome. What if the hero of one of Jesus' most famous stories was someone your entire world had been taught to despise? Not someone slightly different from you, not someone from the wrong side of town or the wrong background, but someone so deeply other, so embedded in centuries of inherited contempt, that simply being seen speaking with him would raise questions about your own character. Someone whose name, spoken in ordinary conversation, carried a faint note of disgust. Someone your grandparents taught your parents to avoid, and your parents taught you, and you had never once questioned because it was simply the water you swam in. That is exactly who Jesus chose. Not a priest, not a Levite, not a respected scholar or a community elder, a Samaritan. And when he said the word, you could almost feel the silence in the crowd shift, that collective tightening as people realized the story was about to cost more than they had come prepared to pay. This is what Jesus did with his stories. He did not merely illustrate nice moral principles. He quietly detonated them, taking the carefully arranged categories people used to order their world and rearranging them in ways that left everyone quietly unsettled. Tonight we step back into the parable of the Good Samaritan before it became familiar, before it was softened into greeting cards and Sunday school lessons, when it was still sharp, strange, and deeply scandalous. We enter it to feel the full weight of why Jesus chose the most hated man in the room to reveal the very heart of God, and why that shocking choice still changes everything about how we are meant to love one another. When Jesus began telling this story, everyone listening thought they knew exactly how it would unfold. A man robbed and beaten on the dangerous road to Jericho, a priest coming down the same path, a Levite following after him. And then, this was the expected shape of the tale, the familiar groove worn smooth by generations of Jewish storytelling. An ordinary Jewish layman would appear, a regular Israelite, not elevated by religious office or priestly status, who would do what the religious leaders had failed to do. The point would be clear and comforting. True faithfulness to God's law was not about titles or position, but about the heart. That was the story Jesus was supposed to tell. Instead, he told a different one. And the difference was not subtle. It was not a gentle turn in the expected direction. It was a quiet detonation, delivered softly, yet devastating in its implications. When Jesus finally named the hero of the story, the expert in the law could not even bring himself to speak the word aloud, because the hero was a Samaritan. In the ears of everyone listening that day, something shifted. Something went profoundly wrong with the story, at least according to every expectation they had brought with them. To truly feel the scandal, you must understand what the word Samaritan meant to first-century Jews, not as distant history, but as a lived, inherited, bone-deep reality. The hostility stretched back more than 700 years to the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC. The population was partially deported, and the land was resettled with foreigners who intermarried with those who remained. To the Jews of Judea, the result was a people who were ethnically compromised, not fully Jewish, not properly anything, a mixture that violated the sacred boundaries of identity. Their worship was viewed as corrupt. They accepted only the 5 books of Moses, rejected the prophets and writings, and dared to worship on Mount Gerizim instead of in the holy temple in Jerusalem. Simply touching a Samaritan, sharing a vessel with one, or passing through their territory could render a devout Jew ritually unclean, requiring cleansing. The contempt ran both ways. Samaritans returned the hostility with their own deep resentment, and occasional acts of violence and desecration kept the mutual disdain alive across the centuries. Many Jewish travelers would take the longer route, crossing to the east side of the Jordan, rather than risk going through Samaritan land. Even the Samaritan woman at the well expressed open surprise when Jesus, a Jewish man, asked her for a drink, because, as she said, Jews do not associate with Samaritans. This was not mild social prejudice. It was a centuries-old, religiously reinforced, culturally transmitted conviction that Samaritans were fundamentally, categorically wrong. Wrong in their blood, wrong in their worship, wrong in their very existence. So when Jesus spoke the word Samaritan in the middle of his story, the crowd felt it. Not as a mild surprise, they felt it as a violation, a quiet but powerful rupture in the expected shape of the tale. The man who lay beaten in the dust of the Jericho road was, by every reasonable measure, a Jewish man. He had been traveling from Jerusalem, the holy city, the beating heart of Jewish religious life, down to Jericho, a journey many of his people made. His attackers had stripped him completely of his clothing, removing every outward marker of his identity, his status, and his faith. Now he lay in the road as nothing more than a human being in desperate extremity, wounded, exposed, bleeding, unable to help himself, utterly dependent on whoever might come around the next bend. The road itself carried its own solemn authority. 17 miles of steep, winding descent through harsh, rocky wilderness, where caves on either side had sheltered bandits for generations. It was known as the Way of Blood, a name it had earned honestly through many ambushes. Everyone listening to Jesus knew this road well. They understood immediately that the attack was not surprising. What mattered now was what would happen next. A priest came down the road, then a Levite followed. The priest and the Levite were not random religious figures added for dramatic contrast. They were the most natural and respected representatives in the entire Jewish world of what faithful love for neighbor was supposed to look like. The priest served in the temple, the sacred center of Jewish life, the place where God's presence was believed to dwell and where the covenant was carried out with precision and devotion. He knew the law intimately, not as distant knowledge, but as the very rhythm of his daily existence. And he saw the man in the road. The story is careful to tell us this. It was not a failure to notice. He looked at the wounded figure lying there, took in the reality of his suffering, made his calculation, and crossed to the other side. The Levite came next. He drew even closer, near enough to see the full extent of the injuries, near enough that his looking could not be mistaken for anything else. And then he too chose the far side of the road and passed by in silence. In the original telling, the crowd would have shifted uncomfortably. Two highly respected religious figures had failed the most obvious test of mercy. Surely the third character would redeem the story's honor, the ordinary Jewish layman who would step forward and do what the religious leaders had refused to do. But Jesus did not give them the Jewish layman, a Samaritan. The story does not record an audible gasp in the crowd when Jesus spoke the word, but its impact echoes clearly in the lawyer's response at the end. When Jesus asked which of the three had been a neighbor, the expert in the law could not bring himself to say it. He answered only, "The one who had mercy on him," carefully talking around the name as if it tasted bitter on his tongue. That careful avoidance tells us everything about how the word landed when Jesus first released it. Because the Samaritan was not supposed to be the hero, he was not even supposed to be in the story. He was the wrong kind of person. His worship was considered corrupt. His bloodline was seen as compromised. His people had opposed and desecrated the temple. He was someone you avoided, someone you looked down upon, someone your rituals and boundaries were carefully built to exclude. And yet here he was, kneeling in the dirt of a Jewish road beside a Jewish man who, by every cultural instinct, should have preferred to die there rather than be touched by him. The compassion that moved the Samaritan came from a deep place. The word the story uses speaks of something physical, a stirring in the gut that travels outward before the mind has time to finish its calculations. He did not reason his way toward the wounded man. He was drawn to him, the way a tide is pulled by the moon, and everything that followed flowed naturally from that deep movement. He went to him. He knelt in the dirt beside the stranger. He poured oil to soothe and wine to cleanse the wounds. His own supplies, meant for his own journey, now freely redirected toward this unknown man's healing. He tore strips from his own clothing to create bandages, giving up part of what covered him so that what was broken in the other could be bound. With steady strength, he lifted the wounded man onto his own donkey, choosing to walk the remaining distance himself, staying close, supporting him with every step until they reached the inn. Even at the inn, he did not simply hand the man over and continue on his way. He stayed through the night, continuing his quiet care. In the morning, he paid the innkeeper 2 denarii, the wages of 2 full days, and made a promise that reached beyond the immediate crisis. "Look after him," he said, "and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I return." He was coming back. This was not a single dramatic act of emergency kindness that ended once the immediate danger passed. It was a full commitment to see the healing through, offered to a stranger whose name he did not know, with no expectation of thanks and no hope of social approval. Jesus turned gently to the lawyer at the end of the story and asked a question that quietly dismantled the one the lawyer had first brought. The lawyer had come seeking a clear boundary. Who is my neighbor? A limit-setting question, designed to discover exactly how far the obligation extended before he could stop caring. He wanted a definition that would tell him when he had done enough. Jesus gave him a story that made the boundary dissolve. Because in this story, the neighbor was not defined by shared blood, shared faith, or shared culture. The neighbor was defined by what he did when he came around the bend and found a broken life lying in the road. The real question was no longer, who qualifies as my neighbor? Jesus reframed it into something far more personal. What kind of person will you be when you come around the bend? The lawyer answered without speaking the dangerous name. The one who had mercy on him. Jesus looked at him and said softly, "Go and do likewise." Not go and feel likewise. Not go and understand the principle. Go, do likewise. The mercy that had scandalized the crowd and silenced the lawyer was never meant to remain a beautiful idea. It was oil poured into wounds, wine to cleanse, cloth torn from one's own garment, money freely given, a night spent in care, and a promise to return. It was the mercy that knelt in the dirt, got its hands dirty, and stayed until the healing was underway. The true scandal was not merely that a Samaritan was the hero. The deeper scandal was what the hero quietly required every listener, including the lawyer, including us, to become. To truly feel what Jesus did in this story, you must first feel the full weight of the single word he chose to speak in the middle of it: a Samaritan. When that word fell into the crowd gathered around Jesus, it did not land gently. It landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of disturbance outward in every direction. Because a Samaritan was not simply someone from a different region with slightly different customs. To the Jewish world Jesus was addressing, a Samaritan was the wrong kind of person, fundamentally, categorically, and for reasons reaching back centuries, wrong. The hostility between Jews and Samaritans was not recent or mild. It was ancient, religiously reinforced, and woven so deeply into daily life that it no longer needed fresh offenses to keep burning. Children absorbed it before they could understand it. It shaped the routes travelers took, the vessels people would and would not share, and the instinctive way a person might cross the street to avoid even the shadow of the other. The roots reached all the way back to 722 BC and the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel. After the conquest and partial deportation, the land was resettled with foreigners who intermarried with the remaining Israelites. To the Jews in Judea, the result was a people who were ethnically compromised, not properly Jewish, not properly anything else, a mixture that violated the sacred boundaries of identity and covenant faithfulness. Their worship only deepened the offense. Samaritans accepted only the 5 books of Moses, rejected the prophets and writings, and worshipped on Mount Gerizim rather than in the Jerusalem temple, a direct challenge to the one place God had chosen to dwell among his people. This was not abstract theological disagreement. It was deeply personal and felt in the body. Contact with a Samaritan could bring ritual impurity that required careful cleansing. Many devout Jews chose the longer, more difficult route, crossing to the east side of the Jordan, rather than risk passing through Samaritan territory. Even the Samaritan woman at the well expressed open surprise when Jesus asked her for water, explaining simply, "Jews do not associate with Samaritans." This was the water everyone listening to Jesus had been swimming in their entire lives. It was not a prejudice they had consciously chosen and could easily set aside. It was the inherited air they breathed, the assumed background against which they understood who belonged where and who was worth what. Jesus had been telling a story the crowd thought they understood. A man beaten and left for dead on the dangerous road to Jericho. A priest who saw him and passed by. A Levite who saw him and passed by. The listeners knew this kind of 3-character tale. The pattern was familiar, and it pointed clearly toward the third figure, the one who would finally do what was right. After the religious leaders had failed, the natural hero would be an ordinary Jewish layman, the common Israelite, without title or special status, who would show that true faithfulness to God's law lived not in official positions, but in the sincere heart of ordinary people. Every listener was leaning forward, expecting that resolution. The shape of the story invited it. The logic of the narrative seemed to demand it. And then Jesus said the word, Samaritan, and the story's shape quietly collapsed, not gently adjusted, not cleverly redirected. It collapsed, because a Samaritan was not a variation on the expected third character. He was the complete opposite of an acceptable hero. He was the person the crowd had been taught their entire lives to exclude from any story where heroism belonged. He worshipped in the wrong place. He came from the wrong bloodline. His people had opposed and desecrated the Jerusalem temple. He was someone you crossed the street to avoid. And Jesus had just placed him at the very center of a story about what it truly means to love your neighbor. The silence that must have followed that single word would have been its own kind of loud eloquence. Jesus did not choose a Samaritan by accident. He chose him with full, deliberate intention. And that choice itself was the parable's first and most powerful theological statement, long before any action in the story had taken place. The lawyer had asked, "Who is my neighbor?" as a careful boundary question. He wanted a clear definition, how far the obligation of love was required to stretch before a person could stop and still consider themselves faithful. He was trying to draw a manageable circle with himself at the center. Jesus answered by choosing a hero who crossed every boundary the lawyer had drawn, and many he had never even considered. The Samaritan extended mercy not to someone like himself, but across the deepest cultural and religious divide in his world. He helped a man who, on any other day, would likely have refused him water. A man whose people had taught him nothing but contempt for Samaritans. A man who, even in his helpless state, had every inherited reason to feel ambivalence toward the stranger kneeling beside him in the dirt. And yet the Samaritan stopped anyway, knelt anyway, poured oil and wine into the wounds anyway, tore strips from his own clothing to make bandages, gave the use of his own animal, paid with his own money, and made a personal promise to return. The mercy was never conditional on being deserved. It did not pause to check the wounded man's lineage, his theology, or his past feelings towards Samaritans. It flowed directly from the deep compassion that stirred in the Samaritan when he saw a suffering human being lying in the road who needed care. And that compassion moved into action without hesitation. Jesus was not merely telling a story about human kindness. He was quietly unveiling the very heart of God and the nature of the salvation he had come to bring. Jesus himself is the true and ultimate Good Samaritan. He came from outside every circle of those who were expected or welcomed. He found humanity lying broken and helpless on the road of its own making. He crossed every divide that should have kept him distant, and knelt in the dust of our condition without being asked. The God of the universe became the unexpected helper, the one from outside the camp, whose arrival scandalized many, yet whose hands were the only ones capable of bringing true healing. He poured out what was his into our wounds. He carried us when we could not stand. He paid a price for our recovery that we could never calculate or repay, and he promised to return. Go and do likewise is therefore far more than a gentle call to be nicer. It is an invitation to participate in the same boundary-crossing, category-shattering, scandalous mercy that God showed us when He came to where we were lying and refused to pass by on the other side. The scandal of the Good Samaritan is ultimately the scandal of grace itself, and it changes everything about who we are called to be toward one another. Long before the Samaritan arrived, the man in the road had already sustained wounds that no bandage could reach. The violence itself had been disorienting in a way that reached far beyond the physical blows. One moment he walked an ordinary road, the next everything shattered. Sudden, unprovoked attack does more than injure the body. It breaks the quiet, usually invisible assumption that the world is basically safe, that the next person you meet will not try to destroy you. Once that assumption is shattered, it does not easily mend. The man lay there differently calibrated, more alert, more guarded, carrying a new awareness of how quickly the ordinary can turn catastrophic. Then came the deeper, more lasting wound. He was seen twice. The priest came close enough to take in the reality of his suffering and still crossed to the other side. The Levite drew even nearer, near enough to see the full extent of the brokenness, and then he too chose the far side of the road. Two men, two deliberate choices, two sets of footsteps that arrived carrying the possibility of rescue and left carrying that hope away with them. There is a particular psychological injury in being seen and left that is different from simply going unnoticed. When no one comes, you are invisible, and invisibility carries its own loneliness. But when someone comes, truly sees you, understands your need, and still chooses the other side, that delivers a quiet but devastating verdict about your worth. The unspoken message lands deeply. Your suffering has been evaluated and found insufficient reason for anyone to interrupt their plans. You have been weighed and found not worth stopping for. This kind of rejection plants things in the heart that can outlast the physical wounds by many years. Shame, the corrosive belief that something about you makes your pain less urgent than other people's schedules. Worthlessness, the quiet conviction that your distress does not deserve the attention of those who pass. Distrust, the protective guarding of a heart that has learned not to hope too quickly at the sound of approaching footsteps, because those footsteps have disappointed before. These deeper wounds do not dissolve when bandages are applied. They require a different kind of healing. When the Samaritan stopped, the wounded man's experience did not simply become straightforward relief. It became something far more complex and ultimately far more transformative. Because the man lying in the road had been raised in the same cultural waters as everyone else listening to Jesus. He carried the same inherited contempt, the same deeply instilled categories, the same long list of reasons why a Samaritan was the wrong kind of person. And now that wrong kind of person was kneeling in the dirt beside him, gently pouring oil into his wounds with hands that, by every cultural logic he had ever been taught, should have remained far away. To receive this care required a surrender that went deeper than physical helplessness. He could not hold on to his old categories and accept the help at the same time. He could not cradle his inherited prejudice in one hand and the Samaritan's genuine tenderness in the other, and pretend they belonged together. The mercy being offered forced a quiet choice, and in his stripped, broken condition, with even the dignity that prejudice needs to sustain itself taken away, he had nothing left with which to refuse it. This is one of the most profound psychological dimensions of the story. The dignity that had been violently stripped from him and then declared worthless by two men's retreating footsteps was now being restored, not by someone he expected or would have chosen, but by the very person his entire upbringing had taught him to despise. The healing came from the wrong direction, and something about its coming from that unexpected place allowed it to reach deeper wounds that a more acceptable rescue might never have touched. Because this mercy was not transactional. It was not based on shared identity, cultural obligation, or any of the usual reasons people justify caring for one another. It was simply given, freely, persistently, and at real personal cost, to a stranger who had nothing to offer in return and no claim to make on the giver. That kind of mercy does something powerful to shame. Shame whispers that you are not worth the interruption, but mercy that crosses every line to interrupt its own journey for you makes that whisper very difficult to believe. For the crowd listening to Jesus, and especially for the lawyer who had begun the conversation with his careful, boundary-setting question, the story created a different kind of inner disruption. It was not a comfortable story. It was never meant to be. It held up a mirror to the specific, often unconscious ways human beings limit their compassion, the categories we quietly maintain, the circles we draw around us and them, the instinctive sorting of people into those whose suffering feels like a genuine claim on our attention, and those whose suffering we have decided is someone else's concern. The lawyer could not bring himself to speak the word Samaritan at the end. He answered only, "The one who had mercy on him," carefully talking around the name. That small verbal hesitation revealed how deeply the heart resists the story's unsettling lesson. He could acknowledge the Samaritan's actions as merciful, but naming the Samaritan as the model to follow would have required admitting that his own carefully guarded categories of who was worthy of respect and compassion had just been powerfully challenged. This is the uncomfortable truth the parable gently presses upon every generation. Mercy that stays safely within familiar boundaries, extended only to those who feel like us or seem sufficiently deserving, slowly narrows the heart. It trains the soul to see less and less of the suffering around it, to grow comfortable with crossing to the far side of the road, and to mistake the smallness of its concern for wisdom about the proper limits of obligation. But mercy that dares to cross the lines we have drawn, especially the ones reinforced by culture, history, and fear, does something beautiful to the one who offers it. It expands the heart. It restores something that repeated avoidance quietly steals away. It connects us to the particular, lasting joy that flows when grace moves freely across the very divides that once kept us apart. The scandal of the Good Samaritan is that it refuses to let us remain at a comfortable distance, and the freedom it offers is found only on the other side of choosing to cross. The robbers did the most visible damage on the road to Jericho, but they were not the only ones who wounded the man lying in the dust. When the priest came down the road and crossed to the other side, he inflicted a different kind of injury, one the beating itself had not touched. The robbers' violence was impersonal. They did not know him. They did not look at him as a person and make a judgment. But the priest did. He saw a human being in desperate need, took in the reality of his suffering, and made a deliberate choice that his own reasons for continuing were more important than the man's need for him to stop. That choice was received, not as a distant idea, but as a quiet verdict delivered in the sound of footsteps retreating to the far side of the road. You have been seen, and you have been found not worth the interruption. When the Levite came and made the same deliberate choice, the verdict was confirmed. 2 witnesses, 2 considered decisions, 2 sets of footsteps that arrived with the possibility of rescue and left carrying that hope away. With each passing, the message sank deeper into the wounded man's chest, beneath the throbbing pain of his body, into the hidden places where shame takes root, where distrust is born, and where the quiet expectation of help slowly dies. This is the particular damage of being seen and left. It is different from simply going unnoticed. Invisibility brings its own loneliness, but it carries no judgment. Being seen and passed by carries a judgment, and when that judgment lands in a moment of complete helplessness, with no strength left to argue against it, it plants things in the heart that can outlast the healing of every visible wound. Shame that whispers you are less urgent than other people's schedules. Worthlessness that makes the next offer of help feel uncertain. Distrust that protects itself by refusing to hope too quickly at the sound of approaching footsteps, because approaching footsteps have proven painful before. The robbers stole his possessions and broke his body. The priest and the Levite stole something quieter and, in some ways, harder to recover. His confidence that suffering like his was reason enough for anyone to stop. For the priest and the Levite, crossing to the other side was not without its own hidden cost. Quieter than the wounds of the man they left behind, less immediately visible, but real and slowly accumulating. Every deliberate choice to avoid another person's suffering, especially when it feels inconvenient or belongs to someone outside our usual circle, leaves a subtle residue in the heart. A faint guilt that may not speak loudly at first. A gentle dulling of the inner instinct that once made turning away feel like a violation of something sacred. The conscience that burns clearly the first time grows a little quieter the second time, and quieter still the third, until what once required careful justification becomes simply the way one moves through the world. This is how compassion slowly atrophies, not in one dramatic refusal, but through the quiet repetition of small crossings, each one slightly easier than the last, until the heart that was once easily moved by suffering has been trained through practice to pass by with little disturbance. The priest and the Levite did not arrive at the Jericho road having never known compassion. They arrived having made enough previous choices in the direction of their own comfort and convenience that this particular crossing on this particular day cost them far less than it once might have. What is lost in that process is more than a single missed opportunity for mercy. What is lost is the capacity for the full, undivided attention to another person's reality that genuine love requires. The soul that learns to look away becomes more efficient at looking away, and less able to offer the depth of presence that makes human connection rich, tender, and truly alive. When this pattern moves from individual hearts to entire communities and cultures, the damage grows deeper and wider. In Jesus' day, both Jewish and Samaritan communities had been diminished by their long centuries of mutual contempt, not only through open conflict and hostility, but in quieter, more subtle ways. Any group that organizes itself around the exclusion of those on the other side of a drawn line slowly shrinks inside. Prejudice passed down through generations does not stay neatly contained. It shapes the very soul of the community, narrowing the circle of whose suffering truly matters, limiting the range of human experience the people are able to be moved by, and training both eyes and hearts to see and feel only what feels safe and familiar. The scandal of the Good Samaritan is that it names this damage clearly and refuses to let it hide behind the appearance of wisdom, faithfulness, or just the way things are. The harm of choosing the far side of the road is not carried only by the one left lying in the dust. It is carried by the one who crosses, by the community that has made crossing normal, and by a world that grows lonelier, harder, and less capable of the mutual care we were created for. Every time another person chooses distance because the near side felt too costly, too strange, or too much like the wrong kind of person. We were made for something far larger than this, and the cost of remaining small is paid in ways we often do not fully notice until we have been paying it for a very long time. Jesus told a parable that quietly violated every expectation his audience brought with them, and then turned that very violation into the heart of the message. The hero was wrong. The ending was wrong. The entire moral shape of the story refused to follow the familiar path these kinds of tales were supposed to take. And yet, when the story was finished, something had shifted in the room that no safely shaped parable could ever have accomplished. The scandal had not ruined the lesson. The scandal was the lesson. The thing that made the crowd uncomfortable was the very thing that made the story unforgettable. Choosing the wrong hero was precisely what revealed the right kind of love. This is what transformation looks like when Jesus holds the story. Not a gentle adjustment of old categories, but their complete dismantling, followed by the quiet, powerful offering of something far better in their place. The wounded man's transformation touched every layer of what had been done to him. His body received real, skilled, unhurried care from hands that brought their own supplies, their own time, and their own willingness to stay. But the healing that reached deeper was the quiet undoing of what the priest and the Levite had added to the robber's violence. Two respected men had delivered a silent verdict through their retreating footsteps. Your suffering is not reason enough to interrupt a journey. You have been seen and found not worth stopping for. That verdict, received in complete helplessness, had settled deep inside him in ways that outlasted the pain of his wounds. The Samaritan's stopping answered that verdict without a single word. Every action, the kneeling in the dirt, the oil poured to soothe, the cloth torn from his own garment, the lifting onto his own donkey, the night spent in care, the coins freely given, and the promise to return, became a tender, accumulating rebuttal. You are worth this. You are worth more than this. I am not finished with you yet. The dignity that violence strips away and abandonment confirms as worthless cannot be restored by comforting words alone. It is restored through actions that make the shame's verdict feel implausible. And the Samaritan's actions made it profoundly implausible. What made the restoration especially powerful was its unexpected source. Dignity returned by someone from within one's own circle carries a certain weight. But dignity returned by the very person your entire life had taught you to despise carries something deeper. A mercy so clearly unearned and unconditional that it reaches the hidden places ordinary kindness cannot touch, arriving from the one direction that self-protection and prejudice had left completely unguarded. The lawyer who had begun the conversation with a careful, boundary-setting question ended it unable to speak the hero's name. He answered only, "The one who had mercy on him," carefully talking around the word Samaritan, because saying it aloud would have meant admitting that the model of love Jesus had just presented was a man he had been taught his entire life to dismiss and despise. That is what transformation looks like when it happens in real time. The story that first offended the crowd's deeply held categories did not leave those categories comfortably intact. It left them with a question that could no longer be honestly answered while those old divisions remained in place. Which of these three was a neighbor? The answer was obvious. The implications were enormous. And the command that followed, "Go and do likewise," offered no comfortable distance from which to admire the principle. It called for embodiment. It required the lesson to move from the mind into the feet, into the hands, and into the willingness to cross the road when every instinct said to stay on the safe side. At the center of the parable stands the one who told it. Jesus is the true Good Samaritan. He came from outside every circle humanity had drawn. He found us lying helpless and broken on the road of our own making. He crossed every divide that should have kept him distant, knelt in the dust of our condition without being asked and without requiring that we first deserve it. He poured what was his into our wounds. He carried us when we could not stand. He paid a price we could never repay and promised to return when the full restoration is complete. The scandal of the Good Samaritan is ultimately the scandal of the gospel itself. God's mercy arrives through the one we least expected, in a form we did not anticipate, crossing every line we had drawn about who the right kind of helper was supposed to be. And having received that mercy, we are sent back onto the road with one clear, tender instruction: go, do likewise. The story that began as a scandal ends as a beautiful invitation to live with the same boundary-crossing, category-shattering, unexpectedly costly love that found us when we were the ones lying broken in the dust. The parable does not remain safely in the first century. It follows you home. It walks with you into the office hallway where a colleague has grown quieter than usual, and something in their eyes carries the particular stillness of a person holding something heavy. It turns with you onto the familiar street where a neighbor lives, whose background, beliefs, or choices sit uncomfortably outside your natural circle of care. It sits with you at the family table, where one person's story makes you quietly look for reasons to be somewhere else. It lingers even in the scrolling comment sections and quick conversations where it is far too easy to pass by what would cost something to truly acknowledge. The question the parable leaves with every listener is no longer theoretical. It is the quiet, personal question of the next bend in your own road, in your own week, with the specific people whose suffering is about to come into view. Will you cross to the other side, or will you stop, kneel, and let the scandal of mercy move through you? The Good Samaritan's mercy was never comfortable. It was never convenient. It refused to stay within the boundaries that culture and common sense had declared reasonable. It crossed them, deliberately, at real personal cost, toward a person who had no claim on the Samaritan's compassion by any of the categories either of them had been raised inside. This is what Jesus is asking you to live in the quiet texture of your ordinary days. Stop when stopping feels awkward. Not every moment calls for grand gestures. Sometimes stopping simply means pausing long enough to truly hear what someone is saying beneath their words. Look fully when your first instinct is to glance away and keep moving. Draw near when your carefully drawn categories insist that this particular person's suffering belongs to someone else's responsibility. Offer help that costs you something real. The Samaritan gave his own oil, his own wine, strips of his own clothing, the use of his own animal, his time, his money, and his promise to return. None of it came without cost. Scandalous mercy is never the mercy of good intentions kept at a safe distance. It is the mercy that gets its knees dirty in the dust and follows through. Cross the lines that feel like wisdom, but quietly function as walls. The lines drawn by background, politics, past hurts, and the slow accumulation of reasons why certain kinds of people are simply not your concern. These lines can feel like discernment. The parable names them as the far side of the road. There will be seasons when you are not the traveler coming around the bend. You are the one lying in the dust, beaten down by something you did not choose, unable to rise under your own strength, quietly waiting to see whether anyone will stop. In those seasons, the parable whispers a different invitation. Receive mercy humbly, even when it arrives from unexpected hands. The same God who used a despised outsider to reveal his heart is still at work through unlikely people today. The help that comes from the wrong direction, from someone you would not have chosen, from a source that your pride or your past wounds or your carefully guarded categories would prefer to refuse. That help may be precisely the form God has chosen for you in that moment. Let the old categories gently dissolve in the presence of genuine need, whether it is yours or someone else's. In your helplessness, allow yourself to be lifted, tended, and carried by the kind of mercy that once scandalized the world, and still does. Every day you travel roads filled with people. Some are walking well. Others are lying quietly in the dust of their own hidden battles. Grief, failure, loneliness, or the long exhaustion of carrying something alone for far too long. The only real question is whether you will come around the bend and stop, or come around the bend and find a reason to keep walking. The scandal of the Good Samaritan refuses to let you treat that question as someone else's concern. It is yours. It is today's. And every single time you choose to cross toward rather than away, the same boundary-crossing mercy that Jesus lived flows through your ordinary hands into someone else's extraordinary need. Go and do likewise. The road to Jericho lies quiet once more. The wounded man rests safely in the inn, tended with care. The Samaritan continues on his way, having given freely without expectation of return. And the story that began as a profound scandal, the hated outsider becoming the hero, now lingers in the heart like a quiet challenge that refuses to fade. Jesus did not soften the offense. He let it stand. He let the word Samaritan fall into the room like a stone, knowing it would disrupt everything. Because the scandal was never the problem. The scandal was the point. God's mercy has always come through the unexpected, the unwelcome, the one we were taught to avoid. It crosses every line we draw. It kneels in the dust beside those the world passes by, and it asks us to do the same. May this story settle deeply into you tonight. May it disturb every comfortable boundary you have built. May it awaken in you the same scandalous, boundary-crossing mercy that found you when you were the one lying broken on the road. The true Good Samaritan is still at work, stopping, kneeling, healing, and calling us to go and do likewise. Sleep peacefully in the love that refuses to pass by.